chemical properties have a sub-classification known as inorganic. Some of the inorganic chemical properties include salinity and hardness. Now, these two parameters are actually interrelated with one another. Salinity, of course, would refer to the amount of salt, while hardness would be depending on the sum of the valent metallic cations, which reacts with the X minus. So this means the presence of salt as well. So particularly, the metallic cations would be the calcium plus 2 and the Mg plus 2. Now, the presence of X minus would determine what type of hardness do you have. There are two kinds of hardness. We have the temporary and then the permanent hardness. For the temporary, this would basically coming from salts of carbonates and bicarbonates. And this can be softened by, number one, boiling. That is if you have small scale. So, just like what you have in your kettle or in your air pot, you notice that there are some scales, white scales, at the bottom and as well as the sides of the air pot or your kettle. That actually is an example of softening of water, because the water that we have, no matter how purified it is by our water concessionaires, like Maynilad and Manila Water, they still contain the Ca plus 2 and Mg plus 2 carbonates and bicarbonate salts. So this would be the chemical reaction that is occurring in your air pot as well as your kettle. So given the amount of heat, you're actually converting your calcium bicarbonate to the white scale that you see. This is actually the precipitate calcium carbonate, and thus you have freed your water from Ca plus 2. The same reaction would also happen if your bicarbonates would be from Mg plus 2. Now, in industry, you cannot boil the water because you would be utilizing big tanks, and therefore that is not sustainable and not energy efficient. And therefore, what they utilize are chemicals such as lime. So we all know that when you add lime in water, you have calcium hydroxide. And since your water would contain the bicarbonates, salts of calcium or magnesium for that matter, you will have this chemical reaction. Again, in this case, you have freed your water from the presence of calcium carbonate. For permanent hard water, these would refer to Ca plus 2 and Mg plus 2 salts, this time of X minus of sulfates and chlorides. And therefore, the permanent hard water cannot be boiled, because you imagine boiling a 1 liter of seawater or 1 liter of rainwater, which are examples of permanent hard water. Definitely you cannot do that, because after some time you would be losing the liter of this hard water. So how do you soften this kind of water? You have to make use of sophisticated equipment or treatment methods such as distillation, ion exchangers, and of course, you may also utilize more soaps and detergents, and you can add soda ash. Normally, your soda ash and washing soda are now added to soaps and detergents because number 3 way or method of treating this type of hard water would not be economical. So, the reaction would be like this. Calcium sulfate plus the sodium carbonate would now be converted into this, and therefore your water will be freed from the calcium content. Same thing with this if your salt is chloride. So again, your water will be free from the magnesium content. Now, with respect to the ion exchanger, coming from the word itself, there is a common silicate material that is being utilized in wastewater treatment. So for example, this would be your ion exchanger. From the word itself, there would be an exchange of water, or ions rather. So Na plus, and then in your hard water, you have Ca plus 2. Mg plus 2, and these are actually contained or reacted with Cl minus and contain also CO4 minus 2. So since there will be an exchange of ion, the resulting medium would contain NaCl and Na2SO4, all of which are insoluble in water, therefore you can easily separate them through evaporation. But what would happen to the divalent cations that you would like to eliminate? They are actually collected in the bottom part of the ion exchanger which contains the silicate materials that I'm talking about. These silicate materials are actually known to be zeolites. Now, since they are silicate materials, you know that they are arranged in a covalent network bond. And therefore, that would be the reason why they have ample open sizes wherein the calcium ion as well as the magnesium ion can be collected. Another parameter under this classification of water is pH. pH is known to be an indication of presence of acids and bases in water. The acceptable standard would be between 6 to 9 pH. And we all know that pH is very important in water and in wastewater quality because it affects chemical reaction or some biological activities. So if the pH of the water and wastewater is high, you can depress the pH by adding alum. So alum serves as a coagulant, and alum is actually aluminum magnesium sulfate. While if the pH is low, you can correct the pH by adding calcium carbonate to neutralize it. It is also related to two other water quality parameters, namely alkalinity and acidity. Alkalinity is due to the presence of hydroxide, carbonate, bicarbonate, and carbon dioxide concentration in the water. And it actually refers to the capacity to accept H+. And this measure its acid neutralizing capacity. That's why it stands for ANC. And this also refers to the buffering capacity of the water. For the acidity, this also refers to the buffer action, but this time it is the measure of the base neutralizing capacity. That's why it stands for BNC. Another chemical inorganic property would be the ion content of the wastewater. Now, normally, the ion contents here are considered to be biological poisons, specifically if these are classified as heavy metals. For lead, copper, zinc, tin, and mercury, these are actually classified to be affecting our physiological system, namely nervous system, excretory system, respiratory system. Now, for lead particularly, this would be affecting our brains. It has been found to decrease brain cells and thus affects low IQ and would affect the learning ability of the child. For the minor ions, particularly for aluminum, this has been found to cause Alzheimer's disease. Now, for minor ions with a +2 charge, which also is true for other heavy metals with a +2 charge, it has been found to cause cancer, particularly cancer of the blood. How? We all know that +2, or the oxidation number of a particular ion, such as Pb, for example, would have the same characteristics as that of another ion with the same oxidation number. Because in your general chemistry, the same oxidation number would mean the same physical and chemical properties. Now, what do we have in our body? we have in our body calcium, right? Now, calcium is actually a major component of your bone. However, your bone, particularly the bone marrow, is where you produce your blood. So, if the lead will be attacking most of your calcium ions, that would also be deteriorating some of your bone structures, such as the bone marrow. So, when the bone marrow has been destroyed, the production of blood cells would now be affected. And thus, we can explain the chemistry behind cancer of the blood or leukemia. Now, for Fe plus 2 and Fe plus 3, as well as Mn plus 2, these ions are found to cause some mint flavor in your water. Aside from that, it also affects the color of the water, because too much of iron and manganese would cause brownish color in water. And therefore, that will affect the color of some fixtures wherein you wash your water with. As well as if you try to boil an egg with this water with high concentration of these Fe plus 2 and Mn plus 2, the shell of the egg will be found to be brownish. And for the sulfate, an ion, this is found to cause laxative effects. Cu plus 2 can also give undesirable taste to drinking water. And then Cl minus, you have tasted already how a swimming pool tastes like. So that would also affect the taste of the water. And then F minus, or excessive fluoride concentration, would cause fluorosis. It's actually referring to mottling of teeth. Or, if you're not familiar with it, it's just simply osteoporosis, but this time involving your teeth. Nitrate ion is also significant because it causes methemoglobinemia, or infant cyanosis, or sometimes called blue baby disease. This is actually a rheumatic heart disease. Another chemical inorganic property would be the nutrients. Nutrients, particularly the phosphorus and nitrogen. So your phosphorus would be produced coming from rainfall due to the phosphorus cycle, and then the distilleries. It has been known that the distilleries would be generating 1000 ppm of phosphorus content. And the reason why we need to inhibit the concentration of phosphorus as well as nitrogen is that this causes a significant phenomenon in water which we call eutrophication. Eutrophication is the enrichment of waters by inorganic plant nutrients. We all know that inorganic plant nutrients in fertilizer or supplied by fertilizer would involve nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. So all of this may be causing an abundance of algae, or what we call algal bloom. Now, this algal bloom happens if you have too much of the nutrients coming from, for example, from washings, which contains detergents. We all know that detergent also contains phosphates. And then also, if you have too much organic waste coming from the plant and coming from residential houses, the N content would also be high. When you have algal bloom, the problem here is the algae, an example of which would be the water lilies. It would be very nice to see, especially if these water lilies would be blooming with violet flowers. But the thing is, these algae have very short lifespan. As based from the study, they only live for 30 days. So if these algae will bloom and they have a short lifespan, sooner they will also be added up as organic waste. So accumulation of organic waste, as we have learned, would also entail higher oxygen demand, and therefore the BOD would be very high, and then the DO, or the dissolved oxygen of the water, would be very low. And therefore, that will lead to depleting of dissolved oxygen, which will be further enhanced if the temperature of the water will be high. And this would cause an aerobic condition due to the lack of dissolved oxygen. This entire phenomenon is what we call eutrophication. Considering the ecological effects of eutrophication, we are very concerned about the dissolved oxygen concentration of a particular body of water. Let's say it's a river or a lake system. Because a river or a lake system undergoes what you call two important processes, namely the oxygenation and reoxygenation. This is actually represented in what we call in the industry DO-SAG curve. This represents the concentration of dissolved oxygen in a river, and this would indicate the natural health or the general health of the river. So, since rivers have some capacity for self-purification, the reoxygenation occurs. However, since you add wastewater, that would add to the depletion of the DO level of the water, therefore the oxygenation also occurs. The DO-SAG curve is one of the major tools of water quality management in rivers. For example, if you have plant A here discharging the wastewater, we would have the goal of maintaining the DO level of this river. We would notice that if we take the DO of the wastewater before the discharge, it would be high. But after the discharge, the DO would be low. So this part is actually the deoxygenation process. Now, how would you apply your knowledge of the DO-SAG curve to manage the water quality? Definitely, in order for you to give time for the water to replenish its DO, you would not be putting up another plant nearby, let's say plant B, so as to maintain the critical DO of the plant. So we will have this plant located somewhere else along the river. The last water quality parameter is biological. Bacteriological parameters include coliforms. Particularly for water, but most especially in wastewater, we measure total coliforms. This refers to the non-pathogenic bacteria present in the intestines, and these also indicate contamination with its numbers. Also, bacteriological parameter would also involve fecal coliforms. Then, we also measure specific pathogens as well as the presence of some viruses in the water. Now, how do we do water purity tests? As mentioned, we need to have indicator organisms. So, these are actually the coliforms, and sometimes you also use Enterococcus. Now, we count the number of contaminants or contamination, and we report it as MPN. MPN stands for most probable number per 100 ml of water sample. One of the ways of reporting the MPN would be multiple tube method. So in the multiple tube method, we have this, and then we apply statistical analysis to determine which would have the highest number of contaminants. We can also make use of another method which we call membrane filtration method. So here you count the number of dots, and the number of dots would tell you the most probable number. For the water and wastewater treatment, the principles would be the same, but most of the time, the treatment that I'll be discussing are utilized in wastewater. Okay?